Everyone knows the phrase. Crossing the Rubicon. To pass the point of no return. To make the decision that cannot be unmade. To commit yourself so completely to a path that retreat becomes impossible. And the world before the decision and the world after it are genuinely different. The phrase is in every Western language. It is used in boardrooms and courtrooms and sports commentary and political analysis. It is used by people who have never heard of Julius Caesar, who could not locate ancient Rome on a map, who have no idea that the phrase came from an actual man standing on the bank of an actual river on an actual January morning 2,000 years ago. He was 51 years old. He had been trying to avoid this moment for months, sending envoys, proposing compromises, offering to surrender everything except the minimum that his survival required. He had written letters that his enemies ignored. He had made offers that his enemies rejected. He had stood in Ravenna watching the political situation close around him like a trap that had been set years earlier and was only now completing its mechanism. And then he had dinner with friends. A normal dinner. Conversation, wine, the specific performance of ordinary life that a man engages in when he has made a decision he cannot announce, and the people around him cannot know. He talked, he listened. He did whatever 51-year-old Roman generals do at dinner the night before they commit an act of war against their own state. He left the table. He ordered the 13th Legion to march. He rode south in the January darkness toward a river that the Roman constitution had made the most important boundary in the world. He stood on its bank. He crossed it. And the phrase, 2,000 years later, in every language descended from the civilization he built by crossing, is still there. Waiting in the vocabulary of every person who has ever faced a decision they could not take back. This is the story of what happened on that bank, and of the man who stood there, and of why the phrase endured when almost everything else from that January morning has been forgotten. The Roman Republic that Julius Caesar was about to threaten when he crossed the Rubicon had been the governing framework of Rome for 460 years, since the expulsion of the last Etruscan king in 509 BC and the establishment of the system of elected magistrates and senatorial authority that the Romans considered the foundation of their civilization. The Republic was not a democracy. It was an aristocratic republic in which the Senate, composed of Rome's landed nobility, held ultimate political authority, and the elected magistrates who governed the state were drawn almost exclusively from the senatorial class. Its central obsession was the prevention of tyranny. The Romans had expelled their last king, and they were not going to have another one. Every mechanism of the Republican Constitution was designed to prevent any individual from accumulating the kind of personal power that could be used to dominate the state. The two consuls who held the highest executive authority served for 1 year only and could veto each other. The magistracies that led to the consulship had to be held in sequence, with minimum ages for each. The holding of military command, the imperium, was carefully regulated, tied to specific provinces and specific time limits. And the most important rule of all, a general with his army could not cross into Italy. That rule was the specific mechanism that prevented military power from becoming political power. A general who had conquered Gaul and led his legions into Italy was a general who was threatening to turn military triumph into political dominance, to use the loyalty of his soldiers to override the authority of the Senate. The Roman Constitution had been designed, specifically and deliberately, to prevent this. Caesar was about to do exactly this. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in 100 BC into a patrician family of ancient lineage and modest current circumstances. The Julii Caesares traced their descent to the goddess Venus through Aeneas, which was impressive on paper and irrelevant in practice. What mattered in Rome was money and connections, and Caesar had more of the latter than the former. His aunt Julia had been married to Gaius Marius, the man who had saved Rome from the Cimbrian invasion, who had reformed the Roman army, who had been consul 7 times. The connection was simultaneously valuable and dangerous. Marius had been the great enemy of Sulla, the general who had marched his army on Rome twice, installed himself as dictator, and killed his enemies in the streets. Caesar had been on the wrong side of Sulla's political divisions. He was 22 when Sulla demanded that he divorce his wife Cornelia, the daughter of a prominent Marian supporter. Every other young Roman in his position obeyed. Caesar refused. He was threatened with death. He went into hiding in the Sabine hills, moving from place to place, buying off the soldiers sent to find him. He contracted malaria. He survived. He survived because his mother's family interceded with Sulla on his behalf. And because Sulla, looking at the young man brought before him, reportedly said that in Caesar there were many Mariuses. He had survived. What Sulla meant was that Caesar was dangerous, that the qualities that made him refuse a direct order from a dictator who was killing people for lesser offenses, the specific combination of political calculation and personal stubbornness and the absolute refusal to be diminished, were qualities that a man in Sulla's position should worry about. Sulla was right. Caesar spent the next 30 years building the career that would lead to the Rubicon. He served in the East, was captured by pirates who demanded ransom, told them they had set the ransom too low, organized a fleet after his release, and crucified every one of them, as he had promised. He returned to Rome and worked through the political cursus, quaestor, aedile, praetor, consul, spending money he did not have on the games and public works and the specific generosity that purchased Roman popular support. By 60 BC, he had allied himself with the 2 most powerful men in Rome, Crassus, the richest man in the ancient world, and Pompey, the most celebrated military commander of his generation. The arrangement that historians call the First Triumvirate gave each of them what they needed. Caesar got the proconsular command of Gaul. He spent the next 8 years in Gaul, building the army and the reputation and the fortune that would bring him to the Rubicon. The Gallic Wars left marks on Caesar that the Commentari, his own account of the campaigns, still read by Latin students 2,000 years later, do not fully record. He had killed enormously. The ancient sources give figures for Gallic dead in the millions. Modern historians discount the numbers, but the scale of the killing was real, visible in the archaeological record of the sites where the major engagements occurred. He had enslaved populations. He had cut off the hands of the garrison of Uxellodunum as a punishment for their resistance. Left alive to travel through Gaul as a demonstration of what resistance cost. He had also shown the specific quality of clemency that would become his signature, pardoning enemies, incorporating defeated opponents into his service, building the network of personal loyalty and personal obligation that made him, by 52 BC, not merely the commander of the Roman forces in Gaul, but the personal patron of a web of relationships that extended from the Rhine to the Tiber. The Battle of Alesia in 52 BC, where he besieged Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who had unified the tribes against him, building a circumvallation wall around the entire hill fort, and then a second wall facing outward to hold off the relief army, fighting on both sides simultaneously with his outnumbered force, is still taught in military academies as one of the most remarkable engineering and tactical achievements in ancient warfare. He won. He came back from Gaul with 8 legions loyal to him personally, a fortune from the Gallic plunder, and the political standing of the most celebrated general in the Roman world. He also came back to a political crisis that had been building since Crassus died at Carrhae in 53 BC. Crassus died badly. The Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, where the Parthian cavalry and their horse archers surrounded and destroyed the Roman legions that Crassus had led east in search of the military glory that his wealth had not provided, was one of the most complete Roman military disasters of the Republic. 20,000 dead, 10,000 captured. Crassus himself killed in the aftermath of a failed negotiation, his head sent to the Parthian court to be used as a prop in a performance of a Greek play. His death dissolved the specific glue that had held the triumvirate together. With Crassus gone, the two remaining members of the arrangement had no mediator, no financial neutral party, no buffer between the specific ambitions and the specific fears that had always been present in the relationship between the man who commanded the West and the man who had commanded the East. Pompey drifted. His relationship with Caesar had been personal as well as political. His wife Julia, Caesar's daughter, had been genuinely beloved by Pompey, and her death in 54 BC had removed the family bond that made the political bond feel like something more than calculation. Without Julia, without Crassus, Pompey was calculating. The Senate conservatives who had always feared Caesar, Cato the Younger, rigid and incorruptible and absolutely committed to the Republic's constitutional forms. Lentulus Crus, the consul of 49 BC, who wanted Caesar destroyed. Metellus Scipio, whose family honor was tied to the Republican tradition, worked on Pompey for years, flattering him, cultivating him, suggesting that Caesar was the threat to both of them, and that Pompey's alliance with the Senate was the natural expression of his true interests. Pompey listened. Caesar watched from Gaul, managing his legions and his provinces, sending letters and envoys, trying to maintain the connection that was dissolving. By 50 BC, Pompey had committed. The Senate conservatives had their general. Caesar had the Rubicon ahead of him. The negotiations of the months before January 49 BC were genuine, and their failure was the specific failure that made the crossing feel inevitable by the time Caesar stood on the bank. He had tried. The documentary record, preserved in Cicero's letters, in the ancient histories, in the fragmentary evidence of the diplomatic exchange, describes a sequence of proposals and rejections that lasted through the autumn and early winter of 50 to 49 BC. Caesar proposed that both he and Pompey give up their commands simultaneously. This was rejected. He proposed that he keep Illyria and 2 legions until his consular election was confirmed. Rejected. He proposed a personal meeting with Pompey to negotiate directly. Pompey agreed in principle and then declined. His advisors told him that meeting Caesar privately would look like weakness. Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, the tribunes who had been supporting Caesar in Rome, used their tribunician veto to block the senatorial measures against him. The Senate, in the session of January 7, 49 BC, passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree, the constitutional emergency measure, and drove the tribunes from the Senate chamber. Antony and Cassius fled Rome disguised as slaves and made their way to Caesar's camp at Ravenna. When they arrived, Caesar had them stand before his assembled soldiers and showed the soldiers what had been done to the sacred persons of the tribunes, men whom Roman tradition held inviolable, who could not legally be threatened or expelled. He was framing what he was about to do not as rebellion, but as the defense of the Roman constitution against those who had already violated it. Whether he believed his own framing or was using it politically is a question the sources cannot resolve. He went to dinner. The dinner that evening in Ravenna, the specific last ordinary hours before the march, is the moment the ancient sources describe and the moment that history should inhabit more fully than it usually does. Suetonius tells us Caesar dined with friends. He tells us the dinner was public enough that nothing about it announced what was coming. He tells us Caesar left the table at some point in the evening and gave the order to march. What happened at that table? What Caesar said? What he thought? What it felt like to sit with friends eating and drinking on the last evening of the old world is not recorded. The friends at the table probably did not know what was happening. Caesar was performing normalcy with a precision that the situation required. A commander who announces the night before that he is about to commit an act of war against the Roman state gives his enemies time to act. The performance of the ordinary evening was itself a tactical decision. He ate, he drank. He talked about whatever Roman generals and their friends talked about over dinner in January in northern Italy, when the world was about to change. He left the table. He issued the order. The 13th Legion began to move. The march to the Rubicon, 10 miles south from Ravenna through the January darkness, was conducted with the specific discipline of a Roman legion that had been told where it was going and had understood the implications. These were not naive soldiers. The 13th had been raised in 57 BC and had fought through most of the major engagements of the Gallic campaigns. Their commanding general had led them for 8 years without a significant defeat. They understood what the Rubicon meant constitutionally. Crossing it made them part of an illegal military action against the Roman state, made them rebels, made them enemies of the Senate. They marched anyway. They marched because their futures were tied to Caesar's futures. The land grants he had promised them, the bonuses from the Gallic campaigns, the specific rewards of 8 years of service. All of this depended on Caesar remaining politically viable. A Caesar stripped of his command and prosecuted by his enemies was a Caesar who could not deliver on his promises. A Caesar at the head of an army was a Caesar who could. They also marched because he asked them to. The specific quality of loyalty that 8 years of undefeated campaigning under the same commander creates is not reducible to self-interest. These men had been through Alesia with him. They had stood in the outer wall while the relief army attacked, and the inner wall held Vercingetorix, and the situation was genuinely desperate. They had come through it because of how he commanded. You march for a man who has done that. The column moved through the darkness. Caesar rode ahead. He reached the river first, the bank of the Rubicon, and at the crossing point where Caesar stopped was unremarkable in the way that historically significant pieces of ground are usually unremarkable before the significance is attached to them. The river was small. The Latin sources describe it as not large, a stream rather than a river, cold with the January rains, brown with the disturbed sediment of a recent flood. It was perhaps 100 feet wide at the crossing. The far bank was Italy, visible, reachable, separated from where Caesar stood by a few minutes of wading or a short ride on horseback. He stopped. Suetonius describes him sitting in silence for a time that was unusual for him. A man not known for hesitation, whose speed of decision in crisis was one of the qualities his soldiers depended on, sitting in unusual silence on the bank of this small river. His officers gathered around him. What he said to them, whether the philosophical reflections that Plutarch attributes to him were actually spoken, whether he discussed the enormity of what they were about to do with the specific intellectual gravity that the sources describe, is uncertain. What the sources agree on is that there was a pause, that something happened on that bank before the crossing that went beyond the ordinary pause of a commander making a final assessment of the tactical situation. He was 51 years old. He had survived Sulla's purges and pirate captivity and 8 years of Gallic warfare. He had stood at the center of the most dangerous political environment in the ancient world for 3 decades and had navigated it through a combination of intelligence and luck and the specific willingness to do what others would not do when doing it was necessary. He had been trying to find another way. There was no other way. The Senate had made their position clear. Pompey had made his choice. The Republic's constitutional forms were in the hands of men who were using them as weapons against him. And the specific claim that he was defending the Republic by crossing the Rubicon had exactly enough truth in it to be the frame through which he could act, without destroying his own sense of himself as a Roman. He looked at the far bank. He said, or did not say, the sources are uncertain, "The die is cast. Anaryphtho kubos," a quotation from the comic playwright Menander. The specific literary allusion of a highly educated man in the moment of maximum pressure, reaching for the classical tradition he had been trained in since childhood. He crossed. His horse's hooves touched the far bank. He was in Italy. He was a rebel. He was the man who had crossed the Rubicon. The column followed him across. The 13th Legion was in Italy. The Republic would never recover. Rome panicked when the news arrived. The specific quality of Rome's panic in January of 49 BC is preserved in Cicero's letters. The private correspondence between the greatest orator in Latin history and his friend Atticus, written in the days immediately after the crossing, as Rome tried to understand what was happening and what to do. Cicero was 62 years old. He had been a consul, an exile, a returned hero, a political survivor of extraordinary cunning. He had watched the Republic deteriorate for his entire career. He had no illusions about Caesar's intentions or about the specific danger of the moment. He wrote to Atticus, "Everything is chaos, uncertainty, fear." He described men packing their households. He described the specific quality of a city that has understood simultaneously that its military commander is coming with an army, and that the men responsible for defending it are leaving. Pompey was leaving. This was the specific disaster that nobody had anticipated, and that changed everything. Pompey, who had boasted that he could raise armies from the soil of Italy by stamping his foot, who had the Eastern legions and the prestige and the military reputation that should have made him the Republic's defender, left Rome without fighting. He marched south to Brundisium on the heel of Italy, took the Senate with him, and crossed to Greece. Cicero watched this in despair. He had expected Pompey to fight. He had organized his own thinking around the assumption that Pompey would fight. The abandonment of Rome, of the city, of the institutions, of the specific symbolic weight of the capital, was politically catastrophic in ways that the military situation could not compensate for. He wrote, "I do not know what to do. Stay? Leave? Fight? Submit?" He eventually followed Pompey to Greece. Caesar entered Rome without a battle. The civil war that followed the crossing lasted 4 years and took Caesar from Italy to Spain, to Greece, to Egypt, to Asia Minor, to Africa, and back to Spain. In Spain, he defeated Pompey's lieutenants without a major pitched battle, maneuvering them into a position where their supply lines were cut, and they surrendered, demonstrating that his preference, when available, was the bloodless victory that preserved the men who would eventually need to be governed. At Pharsalus in Greece in 48 BC, he finally faced Pompey directly. Pompey had the larger army. He had the Senate's legitimacy behind him and the resources of the East and the specific military reputation that had defined Roman politics for 20 years. Caesar had the veterans of the Gallic Wars and 8 years of unbroken command. Caesar won. Pompey fled to Egypt and was murdered on the shore, his head presented to Caesar when Caesar arrived, believing that delivering Caesar's enemy would earn Roman favor. Caesar wept. Whether the weeping was genuine grief for the man who had been his ally and his enemy and his son-in-law, or the political calculation that weeping was the appropriate public response to the murder of a consul of Rome, or both simultaneously. The sources do not allow a clean answer. In Egypt, he met Cleopatra. She was smuggled into his presence, rolled in a carpet, or in a sack, the sources differ. And she impressed him sufficiently that he supported her claim to the Egyptian throne against her brother. He spent the winter in Alexandria. She bore him a son. He continued the war. Africa, Spain, the systematic destruction of every Pompeian force that had regrouped. By 45 BC, the war was over. He was master of the Roman world. He was appointed dictator, then dictator for 10 years, then dictator for life, dictator perpetuo. The Senate had spent 4 centuries designing the Constitution to prevent exactly this. The Ides of March, the 15th of March, 44 BC, began as an ordinary morning. Caesar's wife Calpurnia had dreamed of his death. She begged him to stay home. He had been warned by a soothsayer months earlier to beware the Ides of March. His close friend Decimus Brutus, who was one of the 23 conspirators who had planned the assassination with Cassius and with Marcus Brutus, came to the house that morning and laughed at the soothsayer's warning and talked Caesar out of staying home. He got into his litter and was carried to the theater of Pompey. The irony of the location. Pompey's theater, built by the man Caesar had destroyed, the man at whose feet Caesar would fall, was either chance or something more deliberate, and the historical tradition has never fully agreed on which. Inside, the senators were gathered. The conspirators had distributed themselves through the hall. They had agreed beforehand that every one of them would strike a blow. Collective guilt, collective commitment. No one able to later claim innocence and turn evidence against the others. Caesar took his seat at the front of the room. A senator named Julius Caesar approached him with a petition, asking for the return of his exiled brother. Caesar had seen Caesar's petition before and declined it. He began to decline it again. Caesar grabbed his toga. It was the signal. The first dagger appeared. Caesar reached for it, grabbed the blade, cut his hand. He looked up and understood what was happening in the same moment that the second conspirator stabbed him. He pulled his toga over his face, the specific Roman gesture of dignified death, the refusal to be seen in undignified extremity. He pulled it around his legs as he fell, ensuring that even in falling he presented the image of a man in control of how he died. He was stabbed 23 times. He fell at the base of Pompey's statue, the man he had destroyed, the man whose theater he died in, the man at whose feet his blood pooled on the floor of the Senate chamber. History is sometimes precise in its ironies. The conspirators fled through the streets of Rome with their daggers still drawn. Rome was silent. Then the silence broke. Mark Antony had the body. He brought it to the forum. He displayed it on a bier in the blood-stained toga, the wounds visible to the crowd that had gathered in the days after the assassination. He read the will. Every citizen of Rome received 75 denarii, 3 months' wages for a laborer. Caesar's gardens on the Tiber were given to the Roman people as a public park. Then Antony spoke. The speech that Shakespeare rendered as friends, Romans, countrymen, is preserved in fragments in Plutarch and Appian, enough to suggest that what actually happened in the forum was something close to what Shakespeare described. That Antony used the body and the will and the crowd's grief and the visible wounds with the specific political genius of a man who understood that the forum was a theater, and this was his moment. He held up the toga. He described each wound. He named the conspirators who were present at Caesar's funeral, claiming to honor him. The crowd turned. Brutus had spoken earlier, a calm, reasoned defense of the assassination, explaining that Caesar had died for the Republic's sake. The crowd had seemed persuaded. Then Antony spoke, and the persuasion dissolved in the specific heat of a crowd that had been given money by the dead man's will. and was now being shown the wounds in his body and told who had made them. The mob attacked the conspirators' houses. They tore apart a poet named Cinna, not the conspirator, a different man entirely, the same name, before he could explain the confusion. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome. The Republic was finished. Everyone in Rome knew it, though they would spend another 14 years in civil wars before the formal fact was established. Octavian, the young man who would become Augustus, the first emperor, was 18 years old when Caesar was assassinated. He was studying in Greece. He crossed to Italy when the news arrived. He had nothing, no army, no official position, no political base. He had Caesar's name by adoption in the will, and the determination of a young man who intended to use it. Antony thought he was a boy who could be managed. Cicero thought he could be used against Antony and then discarded. The conspirators, in their exile, thought he was irrelevant. None of them were right. Octavian spent the next 14 years maneuvering through the most dangerous political environment in the ancient world, building alliances and breaking them, fighting wars and making peace, eliminating rivals with the patient intelligence of someone who had grown up watching how quickly powerful men could be destroyed by enemies who seemed less powerful. He defeated Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BC. He was 32 years old. He was the undisputed master of the Roman world. He then did what Caesar had not done. He avoided every mistake that had made Caesar's position unstable. He did not call himself dictator. He did not concentrate power in forms that the Roman tradition found intolerably visible. He called himself princeps, first citizen, and preserved every form of the republic while making it impossible for the republican substance to reassert itself. He reigned for 44 years and died in bed. Caesar had reigned as dictator for 4 years and died on the Senate floor. The lesson of the Rubicon, that the crossing was possible, but that what came after the crossing had to be managed with more subtlety than Caesar had managed it, was the lesson that Octavian had learned and applied. The empire he built lasted 500 years in the West. The phrase endured because the thing it described endured. 2,000 years after Caesar stood on the bank of a small river in northern Italy and crossed it, the phrase is in every Western language. Business leaders use it. Politicians use it. Athletes use it. Military historians use it. People who have never heard of the Roman Republic and could not tell you what year 49 BC was, use it to describe decisions they cannot take back. Crossing the Rubicon. They are using Caesar's decision. They are reaching, without knowing it in most cases, for the image that a specific man provided on a specific morning on a specific riverbank. Because the image is so precise and so universal, that 2,000 years have not found a better way to say what it says. The irreversible decision, the point of no return, the moment before which you could still retreat, and after which retreat is impossible. The die is cast. The phrase carries everything. The gambling metaphor, the die in the air, the outcome uncertain, the commitment total. The classical reference, Menander's comedy, quoted by a Roman general in the moment of maximum historical weight. The specific quality of a man who understood what he was doing and did it anyway, who made the calculation and found it acceptable, who stood on the bank and looked at the other side and chose to be the man who had crossed. He crossed. The river still runs. The world he made is still standing. You are in it. Every time you say the phrase, you are in it. The die was cast on a January morning in 49 BC. We are still living in the world where it landed. The republic that Caesar crossed the Rubicon to destroy or to save, depending on which source you read, had been imperfect in ways that the subsequent tradition tends to overlook in its grief for what was lost. The Roman Senate that positioned itself as the defender of republican virtue was the same Senate that had governed an empire through methods of extraordinary violence and systematic extraction, that had enriched the senatorial class through the exploitation of the provinces, that had watched the Gracchi brothers be murdered for proposing land reforms that might have stabilized the social tensions that were tearing the republic apart, that had produced the civil wars of Sulla and Marius through its own factional conflicts long before Caesar was old enough to matter. The Roman Republic by 49 BC was not the stable, virtuous institution of the idealized tradition. It was a political system that had been in crisis for a century, unable to manage the social pressures produced by imperial expansion, unable to prevent the accumulation of military power in individual hands that the professional army reform had made possible, unable to maintain the constitutional checks that its founders had designed because the conditions of empire had made those checks increasingly ineffective. The specific men who were driving the confrontation with Caesar, Cato the Younger, Lentulus, Metellus Scipio, were not disinterested defenders of constitutional principle. They were men whose social and political positions depended on the existing distribution of power within the Senate. Men who understood that a Caesar who dominated Roman politics would dominate it at their expense. They were right about this. Caesar was not a selfless reformer. He was an extraordinarily ambitious man who had spent 30 years building toward a political dominance that the Republic's constitutional framework could not accommodate without being fundamentally changed. Both things are true. The Senate was using the Constitution as a weapon against Caesar. Caesar was using his army as a weapon against the Constitution. Neither side was simply virtuous. What is also true is that the specific freedoms the Republic protected, freedom from arbitrary execution, from property confiscation without legal process, from the personal tyranny of an unchecked ruler, were real, even if they were primarily available to the senatorial class that the Republic was designed to serve. Caesar destroyed those freedoms for the men who had benefited from them. He created, in the empire that grew from his crossing, a different set of conditions: order, administrative coherence, the specific kind of stability that a single coherent authority provides, and the specific vulnerability to personal tyranny that a single coherent authority always creates. The Rubicon was the crossing between two imperfect systems. History does not offer clean choices between good and evil. It offers choices between different distributions of imperfection. Caesar chose the specific quality of Caesar's clemency, the clementia Caesaris, that became one of the political virtues he most carefully cultivated, is visible throughout the Civil War and is one of the more interesting aspects of his political character. After Pharsalus, the defeated Pompeians who surrendered were pardoned. After the fall of Rome, those who had fled with Pompey and then returned were welcomed back. Marcus Junius Brutus himself, who had fought for Pompey against Caesar at Pharsalus and was captured afterward, was pardoned, given high office, trusted with the governorship of Cisalpine Gaul. The clemency was both genuine and calculated. Genuine because Caesar appears to have believed that the Civil War was a family dispute within the Roman governing class rather than a war between enemies. That the men who had opposed him were Romans whose talents and whose cooperation he would need once the fighting was over, and that killing them would create martyrs and grievances that would outlast him. Calculated because every pardoned enemy was a demonstration of Caesar's magnanimity, a contrast to the bloody prescriptions of Sulla, a political advertisement for the specific quality of rule that a Caesar-dominated Rome would provide. The clemency was real, and it was strategic, and the two qualities cannot be separated in a man of Caesar's intelligence. It also, ultimately, killed him. Brutus, pardoned and elevated and trusted, put a dagger into him 23 times. Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's most trusted officers, was one of the 23 conspirators who did the same. The clemency that Caesar believed would create loyalty created opportunity instead. The men he pardoned and promoted were the men with the access and the standing to get close enough to kill him. He understood the risk. The sources record that he dismissed his Spanish bodyguard because he was tired of living under protection, that he said it was better to die once than to live in constant fear of death. He died once. At the base of Pompey's statue. Cicero sat in his library at his estate at Tusculum in the weeks after the crossing, and wrote letters that are among the most remarkable documents of the ancient world. He was 62 years old and frightened. He had spent his entire career defending the Republic through the specific instrument he commanded better than any living Roman: the spoken and written word, the Latin language used at its highest capacity, the rhetorical art that he had practiced since boyhood and brought to a level that no subsequent Latin writer would fully equal. He wrote to Atticus, "I am at a loss. What am I to do? Stay in Italy and be complicit? Follow Pompey and be useful to those who are fighting? Retire from public life?" He wrote, "Pompey's plan, if he has one, escapes me entirely. He has abandoned Rome. He abandoned Italy. Now he has gone to Greece." What is he thinking? He wrote about the specific quality of fear in a city that does not know whether the army coming toward it is coming as liberator or conqueror. The paralysis of a population that has absorbed the lesson of Sulla's march and does not know whether this march will produce the same results. He eventually followed Pompey to Greece. He fought on the wrong side. He was pardoned by Caesar afterward. Caesar, who needed Cicero's endorsement more than he needed his punishment, who understood that the greatest living Latin writer expressing approval of the new regime was worth more than the greatest living Latin writer dead. Cicero spent the years of Caesar's dictatorship writing philosophy in his villas, producing the works that would transmit the Stoic and academic philosophical traditions to the medieval world, processing his exclusion from political life through the specific consolation that the classical tradition offered to men who had lost the power to act. After the Ides of March, he returned to political life for the last time. He delivered the Philippics, 14 speeches attacking Antony with every rhetorical weapon available in the Latin language. Speeches that are still read as models of political oratory, that establish the template for the political attack speech in every subsequent culture that inherited the classical tradition. Antony had him killed. His hands and his head were displayed on the rostra in the Forum, the speaker's platform where he had delivered the speeches that were his greatest achievement, where his hands had gestured and his mouth had shaped the Latin sentences that had defined the Republic's final generation. The voice that had argued for the Republic for 40 years was silenced on the platform where it had been loudest. The Republic had died at the Rubicon. Cicero died in December of 43 BC. By then, the dying was merely formal. Marcus Junius Brutus, whose name became synonymous with the conspirators' act in every language that inherited the story, was a more complicated figure than the roles assigned to him in the tradition allow. He was the man of principle who killed his benefactor. He was also a man who had been on the wrong side at Pharsalus, captured, pardoned, elevated, given the governorship of Cisalpine Gaul, the very province that the Rubicon had secured, by the man he would eventually kill. He had read the Stoic philosophers. He believed, with what appears to have been genuine conviction rather than political calculation, that the Republic was worth dying for, that the specific tradition of collective governance that the Senate represented, whatever its imperfections, was preferable to the rule of any single man, however capable. He was probably right about this as a philosophical matter. He was wrong about what killing Caesar would produce. Cassius, who planned the assassination with him, was the harder man, less ideological, more practically motivated by the specific resentments and ambitions that 20 years of Roman political life had accumulated in him. He organized the conspiracy. He recruited the 23. He needed Brutus's participation not for Brutus's tactical contribution, but for the legitimacy his name carried. The descendant of the Brutus, who had expelled the last Etruscan king, whose family identity was tied to the founding act of the Republic itself. He needed Brutus to make the killing look like principle rather than ambition. Brutus provided that. He was, in the traditional reading of the story, the only one of the conspirators who killed Caesar from genuine Republican conviction rather than personal grievance or ambition. This may even be true. He died at Philippi in 42 BC, his forces broken by Antony and Octavian. He fell on his own sword. His last words, as recorded by the ancient sources, expressed regret not for killing Caesar but for finding too late that virtue was only a word, that the philosophical conviction that had sustained him through the decision and the act and the flight from Rome had not produced the outcome that the philosophy had promised. The Republic had not been restored. The killing had made things worse. He had killed the right man for the right reasons and been absolutely wrong about what killing him would accomplish. The Roman world that Julius Caesar transformed when he crossed the Rubicon lasted, in its various forms, for 2,000 years after the crossing. The Western Empire fell in 476 AD, 525 years after Caesar crossed the river. The Eastern Empire, Byzantium, lasted until 1453, 1,500 years after the crossing. The Holy Roman Empire, which traced its origin to Charlemagne's coronation in 800 AD, and which claimed the specific inheritance of the Roman imperial tradition, lasted until 1806. The legal tradition that Roman lawyers developed under the empire, codified by Justinian in the 6th century AD, is the foundation of the civil law systems that govern most of the world outside the English common law tradition. French law, German law, Spanish law, Italian law, the laws of Latin America, the laws of Japan and South Korea, all derive from the Roman tradition that the empire developed and transmitted. The calendar that Caesar reformed in 46 BC remained the standard calendar of the Western world for 15.5 centuries. Every month of July for 2,000 years has been named for him. The Gregorian reform of 1582 corrected a small, accumulated error, but preserved the Julian structure, the months, the days, the specific organization of the year that Caesar introduced. The title Caesar became Kaiser in German and Tsar in Russian. The last Kaiser of Germany abdicated in 1918. The last Tsar of Russia was shot in a cellar in Ekaterinburg in the same year. Both titles had been in continuous use for approximately 2,000 years, derived from the family name of the man who crossed the Rubicon. And the phrase itself, crossing the Rubicon, in English, in French, in Spanish, in German, in Italian, in Portuguese, in Russian, in every language that has been touched by the Western classical tradition, used by people who do not know its origin, who do not know the name of the man who provided the image, who are simply reaching for the most precise available expression for the irreversible decision, and finding, as every generation before them has found, that the image Caesar provided 2,000 years ago has not been improved on. He crossed the river. The phrase crossed into every language. The river still runs. The crossing of the Rubicon is the moment history fixed on, because it is the moment that was genuinely irreversible in a way that the preceding months were not. Before the crossing, everything could theoretically have been resolved. The negotiations could have succeeded. The Senate could have offered terms that Caesar could accept. Pompey could have chosen neutrality. These possibilities were increasingly implausible as the winter of 49 BC progressed. But they were not impossible. The political situation had not yet hardened into war. The crossing made war inevitable. Not because crossing the river was itself a military threat. One legion in northern Italy was not an immediate danger to Rome. But because the crossing was a political statement that could not be retracted, a public act that made Caesar an enemy of the state under the terms of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, that required everyone else in the Roman political system to respond to it by choosing sides. The die was cast not because one man crossed a river, but because crossing the river announced publicly and irrevocably what had previously been only privately understood. That the constitutional crisis could not be resolved within the constitutional framework, that the weapons available were military rather than political, that the Republic's mechanisms for managing conflict had failed. Caesar had made the decision before he got to the river. The river was where he announced it. The die had been cast in Ravenna at the dinner table when he left the table and gave the order to march. The bank of the Rubicon was where the announcement became permanent. He crossed. The die was cast. The world changed. The phrase endured. 2,000 years later, we use it because nothing better has been found. The crossing is still the crossing. The point of no return is still the point of no return. The die once thrown is still in the air. We are living in the world where it landed. The specific texture of the Roman Senate chamber, the theater of Pompey on the Ides of March, is worth inhabiting because the location is one of the most complete ironies in Western history, and because the events in that room deserve more than the summary they usually receive. The Roman Senate had been meeting in Pompey's theater while the Senate House, the Curia, was being rebuilt. The theater that Pompey had built, that bore Pompey's name, that contained Pompey's statue at its center. This was where the Senate assembled on March 15th, 44 BC. This was where the conspirators had been waiting for weeks for the right moment, the moment when Caesar would be present and accessible, and their carefully constructed network of mutual commitment would be tested. Caesar came in and took his seat at the front of the room, in front of the statue of the man he had destroyed. The conspirators had distributed themselves around the hall over the preceding days, finding reasons to be present, managing the specific anxiety of 23 people who share a secret that will end some of them if it is discovered, and will end all of them if it is not acted on. When Julius Caesar approached with his petition, the other conspirators moved toward Caesar under the pretense of supporting the petition, getting close, positioning themselves. Caesar grabbed the toga. The first dagger appeared. Caesar grabbed for the blade, a reflex, the body's instinct when it understands what is happening before the mind has fully caught up. The blade cut his hand. He looked up. He looked at the faces in the room. He saw Brutus among them. He pulled his toga over his face. What the toga pulling meant, whether it was resignation to the death that was coming, a desire to die with dignity rather than in the visible extremity of being stabbed to death, the specific Roman refusal to give his enemies the satisfaction of seeing his final expression, is not something the ancient sources can tell us with certainty. It is the most human detail of the assassination, and the one that has carried the most weight in the subsequent tradition, because it speaks to the specific quality of a man who maintained his composure in the final moments when composure was all that remained. He pulled his legs in as he fell. He fell at Pompey's feet. 23 wounds. The senators who were not part of the conspiracy fled in terror. The conspirators stood with their daggers drawn, covered in blood that was not all Caesar's. In the press of 23 men stabbing at the same target, some of them had wounded each other. They went to the Capitol. They had planned the killing. They had not planned what came next. The aftermath of the Ides of March was quieter than the conspirators had expected, and then much louder. The immediate response was not the outpouring of popular relief at the tyrant's death that Brutus had anticipated. It was silence, followed by the specific kind of urban fear that a political assassination produces. No one knowing what it meant. No one knowing whether there was more violence coming, everyone waiting to see what happened next. Brutus gave his speech in the Forum. Rational, measured, Republican. The crowd listened. The crowd seemed moved. They let him speak without attacking him. Then Antony spoke. The body was on the bier. The toga was still blood-stained. Antony held it up. He described the wounds. He read the will. The crowd did not remain measured after Antony's speech. What Antony understood that Brutus did not understand was that the Forum was not a law court where rational argument wins by its intrinsic quality. It was a theater where the performance of emotion and the specific manipulation of symbols, the toga, the wounds, the money left to each citizen, would determine the outcome. Brutus had made the better argument. Antony had given the better performance. The mob attacked the conspirators' houses. A poet named Helvius Cinna, who had written a poem celebrating Caesar's death but whose name was the same as the conspirator Cornelius Cinna, was torn apart in the street before he could explain the confusion. The crowd wanted blood and was not particular about whose blood it was. Brutus and Cassius left Rome. They would never return. The Republic had been killed not by Caesar, but by the conspirators who killed Caesar to save it. This is the final irony of the Rubicon story. That the act meant to reverse the crossing, in fact, made the crossing permanent. Caesar's dictatorship was personal and temporary, and might have ended with his death if the conspirators had managed the aftermath with the political intelligence that the assassination itself required. Instead, they killed him and walked away from the body, leaving the political vacuum to be filled by men who would eventually be worse than Caesar. Antony and then Octavian. The empire in its 500 years. The crossing had been made. There was no going back. Julius Caesar's body was burned on an improvised funeral pyre in the Forum, built by the crowd from whatever materials they could find. Benches, stalls, the clothing off their backs. The cremation was not the formal state funeral of a dictator perpetuo. It was the spontaneous grief of a crowd that had understood, through Antony's speech, that the man who had given them games and money, and the specific quality of attention that Caesar had always paid to the Roman people was gone, and that the men who had killed him had done it not for the people's benefit, but for their own. The flames of the improvised pyre became the fire that the crowd carried to the conspirators' houses. The ashes were gathered afterward and placed in the mausoleum that Caesar had commissioned for himself near the Campus Martius. A temple was eventually built on the site of the cremation in the Forum. The temple of the deified Julius, consecrated in 29 BC by Octavian after his victory at Actium. The temple no longer stands. The podium on which it sat is still there in the Roman Forum, a platform of ancient stone that tourists walk past without always knowing what it is. On the platform, flowers are placed regularly by visitors who come specifically to honor Caesar, who come from across the world to stand at the place where Julius Caesar's body burned and to feel the specific weight of being present at the physical location of a historical moment. 2,000 years after his death, flowers on the stones where he burned. He is in those stones. He is in the calendar that organizes every month of July. He is in the word Kaiser and the word Tsar. He is in the phrase that every language inherited from the moment he stood on a riverbank in January of 49 BC and chose to cross. The die is cast. The river still runs. The world it made is the world you are in. The Gallic Wars gave Caesar something that no amount of political maneuvering in Rome could have given him. The specific authority that comes from 8 years of continuous, undefeated command, from men who had been through Alesia and the Rhine crossings and the raids into Britain, and the dozens of smaller engagements that the commentarii describe, and the dozens more it does not. The legionaries who crossed the Rubicon with the 13th were not the citizen militia of the early Republic. Farmers who had left their fields for a season's campaign and returned to their land when it was over. They were professional soldiers, the product of the Marian reforms of the late 2nd century that had transformed the Roman army from a property-owning citizen militia into a standing professional force. They had enlisted for 20 years. Their homes were the camps. Their families were the men they had served with. When Caesar explained the situation to them, showed them the expelled tribunes, described the Senate's ultimatum, framed the crossing as the defense of their rights and his, they were making a calculation that was both political and personal. Their futures were tied to his. The land grants he had promised, the donatives from the Gallic campaigns, the specific rewards of 8 years of service. All of this depended on Caesar remaining politically viable and able to fulfill his obligations to them. But the calculation was not only financial. The specific quality of loyalty that a great commander generates in soldiers who have served with him for years in difficult conditions is not reducible to self-interest. It is the product of shared experience, of having been in situations where the commander's decisions kept you alive and where you had learned, by the evidence of outcomes, that the man in charge was worth following. Caesar had earned that loyalty. The soldiers who crossed the Rubicon were not just following orders or calculating their financial interests. They were following the man who had led them for 8 years and had never led them wrong. They crossed the river itself. The small brown stream that Caesar crossed in January of 49 BC is one of the most historically over-discussed and physically under-impressive pieces of ground in Western civilization. The specific identification of the modern river with the ancient Rubicon was disputed for centuries. The river changed course. The ancient boundary marker was lost sometime in the medieval period. Several different streams in the region of northeastern Italy were proposed as candidates, each with local traditions and scholarly champions. The Italian government officially identified the Fiumicino River near the town of Savignano sul Rubicone as the ancient Rubicon in 1933. The identification was somewhat politically motivated by Mussolini's government, which had reasons for wanting the heroic moment of Caesar's decisive action to be located in a specific and visitable place. Subsequent scholars have continued to debate the identification. The town changed its name. It was Savignano di Romagna before 1933. It is Savignano sul Rubicone, Savignano on the Rubicon. Since the identification, the town's identity bound up with the specific moment of historical significance that the river may or may not represent. There is a small monument. There is a plaque. There is the name in the town and in the river and in the phrase that has traveled further than any other piece of ancient geography. The river is genuinely unremarkable. Brown in winter, reduced in summer, flowing through flat agricultural country. A traveler who does not know the history drives past it without noting it. A traveler who knows the history cannot drive past it without stopping. The stopping is the appropriate response. Here, or approximately here, a man made the decision that ended a republic and started an empire, and gave a phrase to every language in the Western world. The decision was not made in a dramatic landscape. It was made on a cold January morning on the bank of a small, cold river by a 51-year-old man who had been trying to avoid making it for months. He stood on the bank. He crossed. The phrase endured. The republic ended. The empire began. The world changed. The river still runs. The legacy of the Rubicon crossing in the modern world is so distributed that most of it is invisible, present everywhere and acknowledged nowhere. July, the 7th month of the year, is named for Julius Caesar in the calendar reform of 46 BC. Every time a date is written in July, the name of the man who reformed the calendar is present in the month's name. 2 billion people use the month of July without knowing where the name came from. Kaiser, the German word for emperor, is a direct transliteration of Caesar. Tsar, the Russian equivalent, is derived from the same Latin name through a slightly different phonetic path. The last Kaiser of Germany abdicated in November 1918. The last Tsar of Russia was shot in July 1918, in the month named for the man whose name they bore. Caesar salad, the salad invented in Tijuana in 1924 by a restaurateur named Caesar Cardini, is named for the Roman general for reasons that are essentially coincidental, the name simply being the restaurateur's first name. But the coincidence is itself evidence of the cultural ubiquity of the name. That Caesar was sufficiently present in the cultural vocabulary of 1920s North America, that a Mexican-American restaurateur was named Caesar, and no one found this unusual. In crossing the Rubicon, the phrase that is in every Western language, the phrase that business writers use to describe strategic commitments, that political commentators use to describe decisions with irreversible consequences, that military historians use to describe the moments when generals committed to courses of action from which retreat was impossible. The phrase is in constant use. The man who provided it is less well known than the phrase he provided. Caesar stood on the bank of the river and made the decision, and said, "The die is cast," and crossed. The die has been in the air for 2,000 years. We are still living in the world where it is landing. The Ides of March is the most famous date in Roman history, and the second most famous date in Western calendar history after the 14th of February. It appears in Shakespeare, in the soothsayer's warning to Caesar, "Beware the Ides of March," which has given every subsequent generation the specific image of the ignored warning, the prophecy dismissed, the fate that arrives despite or because of the attempt to avoid it. It appears in the annual observance that still takes place in the Roman Forum, where people gather on March 15th to mark the anniversary of the assassination, to stand on the stones near the temple of the deified Julius, and to acknowledge that, on this date, 2,000 years ago, something happened here that changed the world. The people who gather are not mourning Caesar exactly. They are doing something more diffuse, acknowledging the weight of the place and the date, the specific quality of being in a location where history happened and where the physical ground connects the present to the past more directly than reading about it in books. The flowers on the stones in the Forum, the monument by the Rubicon, the name in the month of July, the title in the word Kaiser and the word Tsar, the phrase in every language. Caesar is everywhere in the vocabulary of Western civilization and acknowledged nowhere in particular. He is the most present absent figure in the tradition, the man whose influence is constant and whose specific identity is known to fewer people than the influence would warrant. He stood on the bank. He said, "The die is cast." He crossed. The words outlasted the man. The world outlasted the republic. The phrase outlasted the empire. We are in the world the crossing made. We use the phrase every day. The die was cast. The river still runs. The man who stood on the bank was not a simple figure, and the decision he made was not a simple decision. He was 51 years old, and he had been in difficult situations before. Had stood at the center of the most dangerous political environment in the ancient world for 3 decades, and had navigated it through intelligence and courage and the specific willingness to do what others would not do. He had survived Sulla's purges at 22 by refusing to divorce his wife. He had organized the crucifixion of the pirates who kidnapped him. He had spent 8 years in Gaul building an army and a fortune and the political standing that made the crossing possible. He had tried for months to find a way through the political crisis that did not require military confrontation. There was no way through. He understood this. He also understood, or should have understood, the sources suggest he understood, that crossing the Rubicon would produce consequences that he could not fully control. The civil war would be destructive. People would die who did not deserve to die. The republic that had been the governing framework of Rome for 4 centuries would be fundamentally altered, possibly beyond recovery. He crossed anyway. Whether this makes him a great man or a catastrophic one, whether the empire that grew from the crossing was worth the republic it replaced, is not a question that military history answers. It is a question that the civilization built on the Roman inheritance continues to ask. What can be said with certainty is that he made the decision with his eyes open. He was not naive about what he was doing. He was not carried away by ambition to a decision whose consequences he could not see. He saw the consequences. He calculated them. He judged them acceptable. He crossed. The die was cast. 2,000 years after Caesar stood on the bank of the Rubicon, the phrase he gave the world is still in daily use. It is used in boardrooms when a company commits to a strategy from which retreat would be too costly. It is used in political analysis when a government takes a position that makes compromise impossible. It is used in sports commentary when an athlete or a team makes a choice that eliminates certain options in favor of others. It is used in military history when a commander crosses the line between strategy and commitment. It is used by people who do not know Caesar's name. It is used in languages that did not exist when Caesar crossed the river. The phrase crossed every boundary that the man who provided it crossed. Crossed languages and centuries, and the specific cultural transformations that turned the Roman Empire into medieval Europe, and medieval Europe into the modern world. The phrase endured because it is precise, because it names something real about human decision-making. The specific moment when the reversible becomes irreversible, when the decision that could still be walked back becomes the decision that cannot. And it names it in 4 words that require no explanation once you know the reference and make sense even if you do not. Crossing the Rubicon. You know what it means. You knew what it meant before you watched this video. You now know where it came from. A man on a riverbank. A January morning. A small brown river in northeastern Italy. The die is cast. The world changed. The phrase endured. The river still runs. The Roman army that would cross the Rubicon had been transformed from what it was in the early Republic by a single general's necessity 40 years before Caesar was born. Gaius Marius, Caesar's uncle by marriage, the man who had saved Rome from the Cimbrian invasion in 102 BC, who would eventually become consul 7 times, had needed soldiers and had not had them. The property qualification for military service, which required a soldier to own enough land to equip himself, had been eliminating eligible men as the economic pressures of the previous century had reduced the small farmer class. Marius abandoned the qualification. He opened the legions to the urban poor, to men with nothing, no land, no equipment, nothing to recommend them except their bodies and their willingness to serve. He equipped them from state funds. He trained them to a standard. He produced, from men who had previously been ineligible for military service, legions that defeated the Cimbri and Teutones in battles that saved Italy from invasion. He also produced something else: soldiers who owed their service not to the state. They had no land, no stake in the republican property-owning order that the state represented, but to the general who had recruited and equipped and trained them, and who had promised them land grants when their service was complete. Soldiers whose loyalty ran to the man, not the institution. Marius had created the instrument that would destroy the republic in the act of saving it. Sulla used that instrument when he marched on Rome in 88 BC. He marched with soldiers who were personally loyal to him, who followed him against the Roman state because their futures were bound to his futures, and because the state had become, in their calculation, the obstacle to the fulfillment of his promises to them. Caesar used the same instrument at the Rubicon. The men who crossed the river were the direct descendants, institutionally, socially, psychologically, of the men that Marius had recruited and Sulla had marched with. They were professional soldiers whose loyalty to their commander was the organizing principle of their military identity. They crossed because Caesar led them. They also crossed because crossing was in the nature of the institution that had been built by Marius and Sulla and the logic of empire over the previous century. The Rubicon was the meeting point of two long preparations: Caesar's preparation for the crossing and the Roman army's preparation over 4 decades of professional military transformation to cross with him. Both preparations had been building toward this. The January morning was their confluence. The die was cast. The phrase, "crossing the Rubicon," entered the formal vocabulary of Western political thought in the medieval and Renaissance periods, when the Latin classical tradition was the shared intellectual heritage of educated Europeans and the specific events of Roman history were the case studies through which political philosophy was understood. Cicero was read. His speeches, his letters, his philosophical works. And through Cicero, the specific political crisis of the late Republic was known to anyone educated in the classical tradition. The Gallic Wars were read, Caesar's own account of his campaigns, and through the Commentari, Caesar's military genius and his political situation were understood by every student of Latin. The moment of the crossing, the pause on the bank, the die is cast, the irreversibility, became a specific reference point in the political vocabulary of people thinking about the relationship between individual decision and historical consequence, about the nature of commitment and the specific moment when commitment becomes irreversible. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the phrase had migrated from educated political discourse into the broader vocabulary of European languages. The specific mechanisms of this migration, through translation, through the education of merchants and lawyers and the rising middle classes who learned their political vocabulary from the classical tradition filtered through vernacular writers, are traceable but complex. By the 19th century, it was everywhere. In the newspapers, in political speeches, in the emerging vocabulary of business and commerce that borrowed the language of war and politics for its own strategic discussions. By the 20th century, it had crossed into American English, and from American English into Global English, and from Global English into every language that Global English influences. 2,000 years from the January morning. The phrase still active, the man still present in the language, unnamed, in every boardroom and courtroom and sports arena where someone uses the 4 words that his crossing provided. He stood on the bank. He crossed. The phrase endured. The river still runs. The world the crossing made is the world that uses the phrase. We are in it. The die was cast 2,000 years ago. we are still living where it landed. The night before the crossing deserves one more visit, not the dinner, not the march, but the specific quality of Caesar's mind in those hours between the order to march and the moment his horse's hooves touched the Italian shore. He had made the decision. The decision was made before he got to the river. The dinner was after the decision. The march was after the decision. What happened on the bank was the public announcement of a decision already made, the point at which the private commitment became irreversible because it was witnessed. What had the decision felt like? He had been in this specific psychological territory before. The territory of the commitment that cannot be undone, the line that once crossed cannot be uncrossed. He had refused to divorce Cornelia when Sulla demanded it. He had organized the crucifixion of the pirates after his release, when the rational calculation said to move on. He had accepted the Gallic command, knowing that 8 years in Gaul would make him either great or destroyed, with no middle outcome available. He understood the Rubicon. He had been preparing for it his entire career. The specific quality of his silence on the bank, the pause that Suetonius describes as unusual for a man not known for hesitation, was not probably uncertainty. He had been certain for weeks. The silence was something else. Perhaps it was the specific quality of a man who has been moving toward a moment for a long time and has arrived at it and needs a beat before the acting can begin. The pause between the decision and the consequence. The last moment of stillness before the world changes. Perhaps it was the literary performance of the hesitant genius that the ancient biographers required of their great men. The pause and the reflection and the classical quotation that the tradition expected at the hinge of history. Perhaps it was simply cold, and he was 51 years old, and the river was cold, and January in northern Italy is cold, and he was a human being in a specific physical situation before he was a symbol in a historical narrative. He crossed. The hooves of his horse broke the water. The 13th Legion followed. Italy was ahead of them. The Republic was behind them. The phrase was ahead of them too, though no one on that riverbank could have known it. The specific distillation of the moment into 4 words that every subsequent language would carry. The compression of a crossing into an image so precise and so universal that 2,000 years have not found a way to improve it. Crossing the Rubicon. The die is cast. The man crossed the river, and the phrase crossed into every language. The world the crossing made is the world we live in. He stood on the bank. He crossed. That is the story. That is all of it. The soothsayer who warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March appears in the ancient sources as a figure whose function is almost entirely literary. The prophet whose warning is ignored. The voice of fate dismissed by the man too great or too confident to heed it. His name was Spurina. He was a haruspex, a reader of entrails, a diviner, the specific religious functionary whose job in Roman religious practice was to examine the organs of sacrificed animals for signs of divine favor or warning. He had warned Caesar months before the assassination, in a ceremony where the auguries were unfavorable. Caesar had brushed it off. On the morning of March 15th, Caesar passed Spurina in the crowd on his way to the theater of Pompey and said, "The Ides of March have come." Spurina said, "They have come, but they have not gone." Caesar continued to the theater. Whether this exchange actually occurred, or whether it is the kind of narrative detail that accumulates around famous deaths to give them the quality of foreordained tragedy, to suggest that the outcome was inevitable, that the signals were there for anyone willing to read them, is impossible to determine. The ancient world believed in portents. Caesar, as Pontifex Maximus, was officially the head of the Roman religious establishment. He had been trained in the same augural tradition that produced Spurina. He was not naive about what the unfavorable entrails and the blood-red moon and the disturbed sacrifices were supposed to mean. He went anyway. This is the detail that the tradition preserves because it is the detail that speaks most directly to something true about Caesar. That he understood the signals and disregarded them. That his confidence in his own judgment was sufficient to override the warning systems that his culture had built around exactly this kind of situation. He had been right about his own judgment for 30 years. He was wrong on March 15th, 44 BC. The Ides of March came. They did not go. He had crossed the Rubicon 5 years earlier. He had set in motion everything that followed. The die, once cast, lands where it lands. It landed on the floor of the theater of Pompey at the base of a statue. It landed on 500 years of Roman Empire. It landed on the calendar and the title and the phrase. It landed on the world we live in. He crossed, that is the story.